Hi everyone, my name is Farhaj, and this is the first episode I'm shooting with faculty. I want to learn more about all the amazing faculty that we have on campus and what interests them. I'm really excited to introduce our first guest, Professor Mitch. Professor Mitch, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
I would not, but I can try. I am a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science here. Also teach in the math and philosophy departments. Background's in philosophy of science. A lot of my interest is in ethics,
Nice.
technology.
And that's something that I found super cool because initially in class, when you were like, you have a background in computer science and philosophy, I was like, this is great for our computers ethics course. When you were initially preparing to teach this class, where you're like, okay, good thing I'm not teaching a programming course or the intro to Python course,
Yeah.
because I know a lot of faculty don't like that.
Yeah, that would not be my preference. I find programming tedious, boring, and unrewarding, but obviously I have a ton of respect for folks who can sit down and do that. I am just not one of them. I am capable of doing it. I just really, 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 really hate the process.
I think it is a love-hate relationship, as you would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat. I like what it can enable me to do, but the process is just really painful.
Yeah.
But you have to endure it. Moving on, I did a little pre-interview just to get some things that you would like to talk about, diving into computers, technology, and the ethical implications associated with all of that. What are your interests?
I think my biggest interest is in the big picture questions. We often focus intensely on specific ethical issues with, say, some particular technology and lose the forest for the trees. This is something that came up early on in the course. One of our student groups presented on globalization, and one of the big things that they highlighted was a large-scale econometric analysis of introduction of technology and which positions does that tend to eliminate, as well as what is its effect on equality in the nations in which this technology is taken up. And obviously there's a ton of literature on this, but I think the results of that study, at least, were it tends to increase inequality.
Okay.
And the hypothesis is that it does so by eliminating typical middle class or even upper middle class positions. And the positions that it creates tend to be higher skill-wise. So it's some of these big picture questions that we have, like, why are we even trying to solve this problem with technology? Those sorts of questions are ones I find really interesting.
For someone who might not have a background with what you're saying and just listening, why doesn't this conversation need to be had?
I think it has a lot of consequences that sometimes are a little hard to identify. For example, for the last 20 to 30 years, the US has been pushing STEM education in K through 12, especially to increase the opportunities for students to get into, in particular, programming, right? Clearly good consequences have come from that, particularly in gender balance in computer science, although it definitely did not solve the issue. It tends to push out deeper thinking about the ethical implications of pushing folks into STEM careers. One is just right now, the computer science market is not very good. We tend to treat computer science in particular, wherein students are being prepared for a very specific career trajectory. And when you have this kind of downturn in the market, it leads to the sort of crisis that you're seeing on all of social media right now with computer science students.
Is one of the reasons why institutions are pushing people, hey, you need to learn to code, and not about why are you even interested in this?
Right.
Or is it seen like a shortcut to having a high status, high paying career?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it tends to encourage that kind of thinking. And look, we need people who code, and I am directly contributing to that because I think it's an important skill to have. But thinking bigger picture about, like, are we encouraging folks who would not otherwise be interested in coding to enter that? Because we now have a ton of data, and we've seen it in a bunch of different industries, that when you push folks into those industries by motivating them with high pay or whatever the social status may be, it tends to be bad for them in the long run.
Similarly, I've seen people on social media in their senior or junior year making videos of how they essentially learned nothing from their CS degree because they were just pursuing it for a means to an end. And they realize that they have no foundational knowledge.
Hmm.
And the rise of AI has impacted a lot of
Hmm.
learning in these areas as well.
Yeah, it definitely has. Somewhat amusingly, coding is one of the big impact areas.
Yeah, there's a slippery slope between using it to learn and assist you
Hmm.
from busy work rather than it hindering your learning. Is that something you've seen a lot in academia, the rise of AI impacting education and learning?
Oh, definitely. Every faculty member I know is complaining about AI usage. Well, okay, not everyone is complaining.
Okay.
Most are complaining. Everyone is talking about it.
Everyone's talking about it. So what's
Yeah.
the discussion?
It's interesting. I have my own fairly specific thoughts on the rise of AI in education, but the overwhelming tenor is that we need to find ways of preventing students from using AI in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And some faculty members going all the way to a place where they're advocating for the university to cut off AI use across the board entirely. Cannot use it at all in any class.
Oh, but how would such policies be enforced? There's always going to be loopholes around it.
Right.
An interesting thing that I would like to know is, are these conversations a bit different when you're having them with CS faculty compared to non-CS faculty?
Ooh, interesting question. Not as much as you would think,
Really?
actually. Yeah. So look, this is based on limited data and on-the-spot recollection, but my sense is computer science faculty are also fairly skeptical that AI is really going to help you accomplish a lot of the goals that, you know, the hot takes suggest that you're going to be able to, look, we're not going to need to write anymore.
Mhm.
We'll just throw it into a generative AI and, now I've got a 6,000 word paper. And like, they too are fairly skeptical that that's going to happen. And like, they're fairly sensitive to the specific ways in which AI is not succeeding.
Yeah.
But they seem equally worried about its rising use.
There's been a lot of conversations on the faculty side on how we can get students to not use it or
Mhm.
learn better. Has there been a conversation of what tempts them to go to large language models in the first place? Because there's professors who give 15, 20-page papers, don't really even read them,
Mhm.
give generic feedback and pass it on. So students feel like, why should they go through this arduous process if they aren't getting
Mhm.
valuable feedback from an expert in the field?
No, there is not as much conversation around that as I would like to see among faculty members. And I'm curious, are students discussing this?
Definitely. I know a lot of students who were really skeptical about AI and then started using it. They were like, college is filled up with a lot of busy work meant to keep you grinding away in the library for no reason. It sort of has helped them to maintain a life outside of academia, and especially it's helped non-native English speakers a lot with their writing. So there are merits, but there's also drawbacks as with any technology.
Yeah.
I remember we were talking about faculty skills on how to assess students' work needs a lot of reform. Does that tie in with the larger AI debate?
Yeah, for me at least. I see the rise of generative AI in the classroom as a good opportunity to take a step back and think about, like, okay, but why are our students motivated to cheat? So one thing you mentioned just a minute ago is the widespread use of what feels like busy work to students. Obviously, you could have a conversation with students about, like, look, this is the goal of including this assignment, and I think a fair number of the things that feel like busy work could be explained better, having a deeper conversation about why it feels like busy work. AI is a good opportunity to think about what are the skills we want students to come out of this particular course or program having, because I don't think the goal of a writing course is to come out with a really solid research paper. That's just not the skill that we're trying to develop. There are micro skills embedded within that larger thing that I think are important, but I frankly don't think the written product itself is even all that important.
Many times I've thought that instead of writing this 15-page paper, which everyone is just filling up with utter bullshit to get the word limit done, I feel like reducing that and having you distill your entire learning within the class would have a more profound effect on the educational outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case in a lot of places. Shrinking the assignment also gives us as instructors an opportunity to really review the content like in a much deeper way. But it's hard to take that first step. Right now, I think students and faculty are caught in an arms race where it's like, How can I do less work as a faculty member because I feel like I'm doing a fuck ton of work and I feel like students don't give a shit, right? Um,
Which is fair.
right.
Which is fair.
But you were sitting on the other side here thinking, okay, he's not really reading my work, so why should I put work into this? And why am I doing it? It feels like busy work, right? So you're motivated to cheat. I'm motivated to remove as much course structure as possible. In my mind, maybe this is a point at which we go, okay, maybe we need to press pause on this for a minute and talk about it.
Yeah, I think the conversation definitely does need to, because currently it's happening. Students are having it with students and faculty. I don't think we've had a forum yet where we're addressing our concerns with the current educational landscape. I think another interesting thing about the rise of AI, professors are using a lot of ed tech tools like flag them and say, hey, you cheated. But there's a lot of cases of these tools not being accurate and reliable. So what do you think is going to happen in this educational tech landscape?
I honestly don't know. My guess would be that this becomes a massive sector of the economy, particularly as it directly relates to education. Just in the time that I've been in school, I have seen us go from, well, we had an institutional license with Microsoft for email, and maybe we had a license with Blackboard or something, to now we have so many licenses for so many different pieces of software, even here at Bucknell, that I have no idea what we have access to. I just learned 3 hours ago that we have an institutional license for Turnitin. I had no idea. But as you say, these tools are not especially reliable. And my sense of what keeps happening is we keep investing tons and tons of money into what really is a social problem, trying to solve it with technology that is fairly inherently flawed, right?
Would you say we're investing into the problem and getting farther away from the solution?
Yes, right? So now, look, say I realize that, like, oh shit, a bunch of my students have been cheating. What do I do to deal with this next term? Well, what I do is probably spend 15 hours learning how to use Turnitin effectively and implement it into my course. And perhaps a better way to spend 15, well, it would probably take a little bit more time. And this is also part of the issue. There's a time pressure on a lot of these sorts of things, and you feel like you need to solve the problem immediately. But probably a better solution would be to take a step back and think, why are students not connecting with these assignments? Maybe I need to explain it better. Maybe it needs to be implemented into the course structure better. Maybe I should just eliminate it. Or maybe there's a better way of having students work on the skill this is supposed to be developing. Or maybe I just need to tell them they need to suck it up and they need to do it. I don't know, but that seems like a better use of time than me spending a week figuring out how to implement Turnitin, which is still going to lead to problems like you hinted at.
And then there's another whole problem of all the work that we're doing just boils down to a letter grade at the end of the day, and that's what people are mainly here for. I don't know how we could change the educational landscape. It needs wider reform, but how do we get students to be more invested into the material rather than just the grade outcome?
I think a lot of the problem is K through 12 education. At least in the US, there have been some pretty big changes in the last 30 years that have pushed us more towards test capture, where teaching to the test is probably the more familiar phrase. And if you're a student, it's natural for you to react to presentation of new content or something that's challenging, to ask, is this going to be on the test? And then to not give a shit if the answer is no, right? That's what you've dealt with for the last 15 years of your life. I think a lot of the solutions need to be at that level. Students are coming in already super burned out. I would guess it's an especially large problem for international students because you've had to do so much work to stand out in the application phase that can feel like a grind to get new things on your resume. At that point, you've lost motivation to engage in these things for their own sake.
It definitely is a grind to get here and a privilege. When talking about teaching to the test, that's something that I've found very true from my own educational experience. At the end of the day, I think it's better here in the US. Back home, you are what
Mm-hmm.
your statistics are.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of emphasis on that. Coming here, I really did admire how you could learn about things because you had an interest for it. You weren't reading for the test, but it was hard to switch my
Mm-hmm.
mindset from this is just going to be on the exam to I actually should care about this in a more general or wider context.
I had the same problem in transition, and I think it's only gotten worse since making the transition from high school to college. So I don't envy students. And at the college level, some of the solution is just not putting as much emphasis on grades. Maybe you still assign final grades, right? There are ways of stepping back from as much grading while still preserving the structure.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to be fairly radical and think you could get rid of that too. Santa Cruz had a pretty good thing going when they didn't assign grades.
Really? Could you tell me more about that?
So I don't know if it was from the beginning of the institution's founding. I guess probably because grades weren't really a thing until the 60s in colleges. Ooh. But it was only recently that they switched from what was more or less a narrative assessment of students, write down like what were their strengths, what were things that they needed to work on, with no attachment to grades, and now have moved to the traditional A through F system. I think that was kind of a market pressure thing for them, but I think it worked well.
I think if learning has occurred, historically we've made progress because people have cared about what they were doing to then have massive impacts within their field of choosing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it would be interesting to take some historical case studies into consideration,
Mm-hmm.
like what was the motivations of
Mm-hmm.
students then. I know we talked about the locus of internal control shifting from a more internally to an external one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think questions like, what's your life philosophy? What are you interested in and why?
Mm-hmm.
What do you want?
Mm-hmm.
Are really important questions that we don't ask ourselves
Mm-hmm.
in today's day and age.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I feel like a lot of mankind's issues stem from we just aren't able to sit with our thoughts alone for too long.
Yeah. I mean, I am captured by the same phenomena, right? If I have 30 seconds of downtime, my phone is almost certainly open.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate it. It's awful.
It's hard to let
Yeah,
go.
it's so hard, right? We've gotten to a point where these technologies are so pervasive, and our phone in particular is such a multi-use tool. Even if I wanted to get away from it, I have to have it for multi-factor authentication.
I hate that if I want to unplug, I am forced into the system. It's impossible
Mm-hmm.
to continue my education
Mm-hmm.
without looking at a screen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And courses are largely being delivered online. We're using Google Classroom, our class, Moodle, and other learning management systems. It feels like I spend half of my damn week updating the Google Classroom page. It sucks.
Mm-hmm.
That's not teaching. It's boring as hell. I'm bad at it.
I also feel with education, the goal is having that student-teacher interaction, and I think technology sort of taken that away from us in order
Mm-hmm.
to streamline things and make things more efficient. Because had we not had, I guess, Google Classroom, we would be forced to drop our assignments in person,
Mm-hmm.
maybe have a 5-minute discussion on what we wrote, what we found interesting,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that's the sort of things that I guess we don't see much nowadays.
I'm curious, if you were to enter a course and all the assignments were to be turned in physically,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the readings were required to be printed out, what would your reaction be?
If the readings were to be printed out, I would oppose that, I think.
Okay.
Because I've had classes where I've had to print 50-page plus readings
Mm-hmm.
and not even go through them entirely. Why did the entire class just waste
Mm-hmm.
so much paper
Mm-hmm.
on it? But there's some aspects where I do think it's helpful. Like in mathematical classes, we had to print out skeleton notes and then fill it. I feel like that was very engaging. We had a template, and if we had a different learning pace, you could skip ahead.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a bit slower, the professor would come
Mm.
help you. It has its pros and cons for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The institution size plays a big factor into these things as well, because you could still do a lot of these in-person things on a small
Mm-hmm.
campus like here, but if you're in a school with like 40 to 50,000 plus students, I
Yeah.
think professors need more help managing the class.
It would not be possible if I were teaching a 400-person lecture course.
Yeah.
Trying to think now. Did I have students turn things in person when I was still teaching at UCI? I think the answer is no.
Really
Yeah.
interesting. In order to move towards more of the ethical and philosophical side of things, these are bound to be some loaded questions. If you don't have an answer, feel free to say so. I'm curious to know, what is your philosophy of life?
I am very bad at reflecting on my own experience, but that kind of use of or engagement with philosophy has never really spoken to me. A small exception, I guess. I'm guessing one of your follow-up questions, are there any philosophers that you really enjoy?
I was going to ask about David Hilbert.
Before we get there, I
Yeah.
will say this is more closely related to kind of personal philosophy, but Kyle White is a philosopher, indigenous philosopher. I think he's currently at Michigan. I'm not totally sure, but writes on a lot of things like, how do we think about time? How do we approach large-scale changes in the world? Do we approach from more of a crisis angle or other approaches? Maybe I'll force folks to read that in computer science next term.
How do we think about time? Like, that's interesting. How does he think differently?
Well, he's drawing on a number of indigenous North American traditions where cosmology conceives time as cyclical. One common theme is an emphasis on thinking about the consequences of your actions as they would affect you yourself in the future, rather than thinking of it as this kind of like anonymous random person in the future that you might be affecting. So it's kind of encouraging a reflection on your actions as if you're the one who would be influenced.
Could you tell me more about David Hilbert? I would just really appreciate your insight.
Hilbert is a figure I've been interested in for a long time. In undergrad, my major was logic, and he was a relatively big deal in the history of logic. He was a prolific mathematician, late 19th century, early 20th century, and a ton of famous mathematicians sort of were either his student or spent time with him. So he had a lot of social connections and just a really interesting figure in a lot.
So what impact has his work had on you?
Yeah, so I think this is something I haven't talked about in public, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and I think that he has some interesting philosophy of science and philosophy of math thinking that hasn't really been read all that much, and that stuff's cool. I think the more interesting thing about Hilbert is the way he approached his work, which is that teaching was a fairly integral part of his research. So it was not like, I think you'll often hear faculty members or students when they're talking about their instructors, they tend to think of these as two different buckets. There's your research, and then there's your teaching, and these do not contribute to one another. Hilbert did a ton of things, like he would have research assistants who would be in charge of, every week they would come in and summarize like 5 articles for him.
Okay.
And then he would use this to synthesize a lot of the research and present a new course on it. So every year he was teaching a new course of some sort.
Nice.
In an area that was not his expertise. Some of it's shit, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of it served as important collections of information. It was a really nice and useful synthesis. His approach to mathematics involved synthesizing a lot of information and trying to provide like very simple characterizations of a lot of these mathematical systems, and a lot of the breakthroughs that he had in his math relied on this kind of background.
That's so interesting. Even if he isn't an expert, he's going out of his way to find new things to learn and to teach. And that's something we might have lost. The essence here, we're so focused on specific that we aren't teaching newer things or things that would be interesting to students now. I've been in classes where I know that's a PowerPoint from 15 years ago and that's still being used, you know. Even if it's Calc 2, you could still come up with some interesting modern day applications and tie it into the course. What are your takes on the course overall just being stagnant and not a lot of new refreshing things being added to pique students' curiosity?
You thinking across the curriculum?
Yeah, across the board.
Yeah, I think, agree with a lot of that. I think there are a lot of opportunities for introducing new material that we really aren't capitalizing on right now. Just personally, I am one who is seemingly constitutionally incapable of preventing myself from finding new things that I discover interesting. All it takes is something happening in my life, and then I'm like, oh, you know what? Sounds cool. I'm going to learn about racine molecules and its application in biomedical contexts. Am I an expert on that? Absolutely not. But it's cool. Many organic molecules tend to have a particular handedness. That's weird. Why is that? That's fascinating. So a lot of that stuff pops up for me.
Whenever that occurs, do you think about speaking to colleagues who are within that field? If you have, what have been their reactions?
I've spoken to folks more on things that I'm actively working on, research-wise. I've been working on some stuff in physics for a few years now, thinking about the applications of particular ways of presenting different physical theories, particularly the mathematical models underlying those theories, and what that may or may not contribute to research in the area. I've worked in quantum field theory on the utility of no-go theorems. These are limitative results. If you've taken theory of computation.
Not yet.
Okay, well.
So enlighten the audience who don't know.
Y'all are going to have fun because you're going to run into things like Rice's theorem, or you'll talk about the halting problem. That's what you say, something can't be done. Give me these 5 ingredients. Wouldn't this be great if we could have these 5 ingredients and still have X? Nope. If you have those 5 things, not X is the case. So that's the basic structure.
We did touch upon this in our algorithms class about P versus NP and the Hall checking problem, like how it's impossible to have a right program that acts as a Hall checker. So, and he did say theory of computation is where things are going to get more interesting for you guys. So looking forward to it. And on that point, thank you so much for your time, Professor Mitsch. I know you have to get going. It was a pleasure having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so that concludes our podcast.
I thought it worked well. I think this is cool. Keep going. Let me know if you want me to harass some fellow faculty into joining. I would be happy to apply that pressure. I almost want to say, let's add some beer into the mix, but...
That's okay. It might have to be not in the library then.
Right. Some things would need to change if we were in that direction.